Your intelligence isn't actually protecting you right now, it's just exhausting you. The reason for that has nothing to do with how much you know, but it has everything to do with how fast you notice things that your nervous system simply cannot keep up with. Most people who feel mentally drained start by looking for the obvious explanations, like being overworked or not sleeping enough, or needing a vacation. Sometimes those are the real issues, but there is a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't respond to any of those fixes. You take the vacation, but your brain keeps running the whole time. Or you sleep 8 hours and wake up tired in a way that rest cannot touch, almost like something inside you was working a double shift while you were out. You have probably noticed this about yourself already, because ruling out simple explanations is something you do automatically. You see through surface-level answers quickly, and you often notice what is happening underneath a situation before most people even realize a situation exists. You read the subtext in a conversation without even trying to, mapping out the emotional logic of a relationship or a social moment before anyone else in the room has even started looking. That capacity is real, and it is not just a story you tell yourself to feel special, but it is an actual feature of how your mind processes the world. Here is what the conversation around intelligence almost never says directly. The same processing speed that makes you great at recognizing patterns also means you are constantly carrying more information than your nervous system knows how to handle. You do not just see the surface of a thing, but you see the contradiction underneath that surface and the possible futures that contradiction might create. You do this automatically, and you do it fast, which means your body has to live inside all of that data without any structure for what to do with it. That is the mechanism at the center of this video, where recognition outruns regulation. Your pattern detection system is running faster than your nervous system can metabolize what it finds, and until you name that gap, your intelligence will keep feeling like a weight you can't put down. There is a framework in developmental psychology that explains this feeling better than any clinical diagnosis ever could. Kazimierz Dabrowski spent decades looking at gifted people and realized that high intelligence usually comes in a package deal with something he called overexcitability. This isn't just being sensitive or overreacting to small things, but rather it is a structural reality of how your nervous system is built to handle the world. It is your baseline. Dabrowski found a few different ways this shows up in your life. Intellectual overexcitability means your mind creates more connections and asks more questions for every single piece of information you take in. You don't just hear a fact, you immediately start weaving it into everything else you know until it becomes a massive web. Psychomotor overexcitability feels like a constant internal pressure or a restlessness that you can't just walk off. You might be sitting perfectly still in a chair while feeling like something inside you is pacing the floor and looking for an exit. Then there is emotional overexcitability, where your internal dial is set much wider than the people around you, which means you feel the full weight of things that others don't even notice. In your daily life, this means that every conversation or tiny shift in someone's tone of voice creates a massive amount of signal in your brain. More associations start firing, and more emotional data gets logged in your system, whether you want it to happen or not. None of this is actually a problem on its own, but the trouble starts because generating a signal and processing that signal are two different biological jobs. They don't happen at the same speed. Your ability to recognize a pattern is incredibly fast, and that is your greatest feature. But your nervous system's ability to actually digest what it detects moves at a much slower pace. No amount of extra thinking is ever going to close that gap for you. This leaves you in a state that is hard to explain to others, but feels very familiar once you've lived in it for a while. You understand exactly what is happening to you, and you can even map out the patterns or predict how the whole situation will end. But here is the thing. None of that clarity makes you feel any better. Knowing the answer doesn't move the load off your back, it just adds more data to the pile your body is already trying to carry. Fiedler studied gifted adults throughout their lives and found this exact same struggle over and over again. These people were constantly told they were overanalyzing things, or that they needed to stop reading into every little detail and just pick an answer. The critics weren't wrong about what was happening, but they were wrong to call it a flaw. What they were actually seeing was a nervous system that was processing life at a much higher resolution than the world was ever built to handle. That high resolution is exactly why you feel so exhausted all the time. You aren't struggling because you are broken or because you're doing something wrong. You are struggling because your system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, and it's doing it faster than your body can finish the job. That is the basic problem we are dealing with, and it actually gets much more complicated once you start trying to fix it with education or therapy. You would think that getting more education or going to more therapy would be the solution to all of this. The logic seems pretty straightforward. If the problem is that you don't understand your own patterns, then learning about them should finally give you some relief. This is the big promise behind every self-help book and every therapy session you've ever had. We are told that insight is the path to freedom. But if you have a high cognitive processing speed, something very different usually happens. You might learn about attachment theory, and within 48 hours you are mapping every single relationship you've ever had onto those new categories. You find a list of cognitive distortions in a workbook, and suddenly you're auditing your own thoughts in real time while you're in the middle of a conversation. You aren't just living your life anymore, because you're too busy running a full-scale inspection of your experience while it's still happening. The frameworks you're learning are actually useful, and the education is real. But the same mental engine that makes you good at learning is the one that turns every new idea into more fuel for the fire. You keep adding more maps to your collection, but the actual ground you're standing on never changes. Research on rumination shows us exactly why this loop is so dangerous. Rumination isn't just thinking about a problem, it's thinking in a way that circles the drain without ever finding a way out. One of the main things that keeps that engine running is the deep belief that if you just understand the problem a little bit better, you will finally feel better. So your mind keeps digging and keeps analyzing because insight feels like you're moving forward, even when you're just spinning in place. When your brain moves fast, this loop is incredibly convincing because your analysis is usually right. Your connections are smart, and your insights are actually true, which makes it almost impossible to realize you've been circling the same spot for months. You aren't spinning your wheels on nothing, you're spinning them on something very real. So the motion feels productive, right up until the moment you realize nothing has actually changed in your life. Education didn't fail you in this situation. Your mind simply took the tools that education gave you and applied its default setting, which is to recognize things rather than to finish them. You end up with a mountain of understanding, but the underlying stress in your body doesn't go anywhere. The gap between what you know and how you actually feel just keeps getting wider and wider. That gap is the real issue here. It's the distance between knowing something in your head and actually metabolizing it in your body. Closing that gap requires something that no new framework or book, no matter how brilliant it is, can ever give you on its own. When understanding keeps piling up, the missing piece is often a place to put what you notice. This video is sponsored by Senda, the AI journal that shows you the patterns and blind spots shaping your life. Most journals help you get the thought out. Senda helps you revisit it and surface what keeps repeating across entries. Try it free for 7 days through the link in the description. From here, we can separate insight from integration. Insight is when you finally recognize a pattern, but integration is when that recognition actually changes how you function in the real world. These are not the same process, and they don't even draw on the same parts of your internal system. Insight is cognitive and fast, and it's the thing that produces that specific internal sensation of something clicking, where pieces align and a structure becomes visible that wasn't there before. That feeling is real, and it isn't trivial. But you have to remember that insight is only a genuine first step. Integration is much slower and more physical because it's the process by which your nervous system updates in response to what you've recognized. Your system doesn't just file the information away or label it. but instead it actually revises how it operates going forward. This process cannot be accelerated by trying to understand more, and that's because it runs on a different mechanism entirely. Think about it this way. You might recognize that you consistently avoid conflict because it felt genuinely dangerous at an earlier point in your life, and you can trace the origin of this habit perfectly. You can name the mechanism cleanly and explain it to someone else with clinical precision, walking them through the logic of why a younger version of you built that response. But then the next time conflict appears, the avoidance happens anyway. It moves faster than your insight and stays underneath your understanding, running on a track that your conscious mind simply cannot reach. This isn't a failure of your intelligence, but rather the normal sequence of how humans actually change. Recognition is a prerequisite for integration, but it isn't the integration itself, and treating them as the same thing is exactly what keeps highly aware people locked in loops. Your awareness can see the problem clearly, but it can't dissolve the habit on its own. Emily and Amelia Nagoski have written about burnout and the stress response, and they describe what completion actually requires from us. The human body evolved a stress cycle with a beginning, a middle, and an end, which moves from threat detection to mobilization and finally to a return to baseline. What most analytical people do instead is detect the threat and mobilize their minds, but then they stay in that mobilized state indefinitely. They try to substitute more analysis for the physical completion the nervous system is still waiting for, which means the cycle stays open. The body never receives the signal that the threat has passed, and no amount of accurate understanding about why the threat feels threatening can substitute for that physical signal. For someone whose most reliable tool has always been thinking, this is genuinely counterintuitive. When your thinking is fast and usually effective, the idea that thinking is not the lever takes a long time to accept. The lever is somewhere slower and more physical, and it doesn't respond to better reasoning or more facts. This is hard to swallow because it runs against a lifetime of evidence that your mind can work its way through almost anything. Your mind can recognize almost anything, and while that part is true, completion is something else entirely. Recognition doesn't substitute for it, no matter how precise your thinking becomes. The word overthinking doesn't really capture what's happening here. Overthinking implies you chose to start and could choose to stop. But what actually happens in pattern overload is more like a condition. It's like a scanner that can't locate its off switch. You walk into a room and before you've said hello to anyone, you've already registered who's tense with whom and whose energy shifted when you entered. You didn't do that deliberately, but your system did it as a matter of default operation, much like how your eye adjusts for light without you telling it to. When you read an email, you don't just read the words on the screen, you read the gap between the sign-off this person usually uses and the one they chose today, and you notice everything that wasn't said, but easily could have been. You hold 3 possible explanations for their word choice simultaneously while assigning rough probabilities to each one, and then you carry all 3 forward into the rest of your day. The email takes 30 seconds to read, but it takes 3 hours to stop processing it. You might hear something in the news or notice a pattern of small events across a week, and your mind moves immediately to the second-order effects. This doesn't happen because you're anxious, but because the connective tissue between events is something you genuinely see. You see these connections the way some people see faces in clouds without meaning to, and the connection appears whether or not you have any use for it right now. None of this is voluntary, and that's the point I want to make. The detection system doesn't wait for your permission, and it runs at a default speed that is significantly faster than most people's. It's also faster than your own nervous system's capacity to complete what the detection starts. The exhaustion that follows isn't the heaviness of effort, but rather the exhaustion of continuous activation. Your system stays alert because the environment keeps feeding its signal, and because nothing in that environment is sending the message that the scan is finished. You're not tired from working hard, but you are tired from never fully stopping. Linnea Passela's work on nervous system regulation describes this state clearly. When the stress response activates, it expects to move through mobilization and arrive somewhere that registers as resolution. The body is waiting for a signal that the threat has passed. But most of the patterns a high-processing mind detects don't produce that signal. Most of them aren't the kind of problem that gets solved in one action or one day. The tension in a relationship doesn't resolve by Tuesday, and the structural problem at work has no clear lever you can pull. The contradiction you noticed between what someone said and what they meant can't be spoken to directly without rupturing something else. So the detection happens, and the system mobilizes, but then the cycle just stays open. No completion arrives. The nervous system keeps scanning because, as far as it can tell, nothing has been resolved. Over time, this produces something beyond simple exhaustion. You start to anticipate the cost of noticing things, and you feel the beginning of a familiar loop starting while something in you braces for the impact. You know what comes next, and it isn't an answer, but more hours inside a question that doesn't close. The awareness that used to feel like clarity starts to feel like a liability you have to carry. Most people will tell you to just think less. They say you should slow down, try meditating, or spend more time getting in touch with your body. While that advice isn't exactly wrong, it usually fails people with high processing speeds in a very specific way. Instead of finding peace, your attempt to stop thinking just becomes another thing for your brain to analyze. You sit down to meditate and spend the whole session tracking your own attention, judging how well you're doing, and noticing the quality of your noticing. The very tool you picked up to quiet your mind ends up giving your brain more work to do. The real issue isn't that you have too much awareness. The problem is that awareness without a structure to process it starts to pile up instead of moving through you. When your awareness just accumulates, every new pattern you spot gets added to the heavy load you're already carrying. That pile keeps growing, and the weight gets heavier every day. Because your observations are usually accurate, you never reach a point where you can tell yourself to stop trusting your brain. Your mind isn't failing you. It's actually doing exactly what it was designed to do, but it simply has nowhere to put everything it finds. Changing your life doesn't require you to notice less. It requires you to build a stronger layer underneath that noticing. You already have a massive cognitive capacity for recognizing patterns. What you probably lack is practice with the regulation layer, which is the ability to receive a signal, let it finish its cycle in your body, and return to a state of rest. This isn't about suppressing your thoughts or detaching from reality. It's about reaching completion. That gap between recognition and completion is where the real work happens. It is the difference between having a sudden insight and having the actual infrastructure to handle that insight. This is how you turn that theory into something you can actually use today. When you find yourself stuck in a loop, especially when you've chewed on the same thought 5 times without getting anywhere, you need to follow this specific sequence. First, you have to name the thought without analyzing it. Don't ask yourself why you're thinking about it again, but instead just say, "There is the conflict pattern," or "The catastrophizing track is running." Your brain needs a job to do, and naming the problem gives it a task that doesn't involve more overthinking. This creates a tiny bit of space between you and the loop without forcing you to run away from it. Second, you need to find where that stress is sitting in your body right now. Check your chest, your jaw, your stomach, or your throat to see where the tension lives. Don't worry about what the tension means or why it showed up. Just find the physical location. Your nervous system reacts to physical attention much differently than it reacts to abstract ideas, and this quick shift breaks the cycle without pushing the feeling down. Third, ask yourself what the smallest physical action is that you can take right now. You aren't looking for a move that solves the whole problem or an insight that explains your life. Just find a tiny movement, like walking into another room, stepping outside for 60 seconds, or drinking a glass of cold water. You aren't trying to fix the big picture. You're just giving your nervous system a signal that the cycle is finished. These steps won't feel like a big deal, and that is actually the point. This process works by giving your awareness a place to land, so that your thoughts can finally move through you instead of stacking. Once your regulation skills finally catch up to your awareness, you don't actually start noticing less, and in fact, You probably see more because you aren't wasting energy bracing for the emotional hit. The real shift happens in how much weight those observations carry. You might spot a familiar pattern or hear the subtext in a tense conversation, but you no longer feel recruited to manage it or carry that heavy burden for the rest of your week. Detection stops feeling like a forced obligation. You have to realize that the exhaustion didn't come from how much you were noticing, but from the fact that you had nowhere to put that information once you found it.